Welcome again to another episode of the Southwest Climate Podcast with Mike Crimmins.
Hey, Zach. Happy Monsoon. I guess.
Boy, we didn't think we'd be here, or I didn't. I didn't think we'd be a third of the way through July and be doing our first real monsoon podcast and have nothing really to talk about in terms of rain.
I know.
I was hoping otherwise.
I'm not freaking out yet. Let's just put it that way.
Otherwise, how are you doing?
I'm good. The swamp cooler is living up to its name. It's not doing the cooling part anymore, but it's doing the swamp part really well today.
Wow. So, okay, we have actually quite a bit to talk about. And even though the monsoon has started slow, and in fact, we can quibble about whether or not it's here in earnest or not, which I'm sure we'll do.
I don't think there's a lot of quibbling going to be happening, but I'm excited to hear what you have to say about that.
I have a little bit to say.
Okay.
But despite that, there's quite a bit of interesting things to unpack about the monsoon season. And also, in addition to that, we'll cover fire, because Arizona in particular has had quite a bit of fire activity over the last month. 2 of the 8 largest fires in the history of Arizona have been this year: the Bighorn Fire right outside of Tucson and the Bush Fire near Phoenix. So, and hopefully when the monsoon season, or when the monsoons come in earnest, we can, for the most part, put a nail in the fire season's coffin. But we don't know when that'll be. So we'll talk about fire. And also, and I'm really excited about this, is we sort of opened up our monsoon fantasy game to the people who listen to this podcast and the people who tune into CLIMAS in general. And believe it or not, we got 36 responses. So that's awesome. So we're going to go over what people have picked and unpack that game a little bit more and try to get people excited about continuing to play and for both August and September. So, all right. So, so the fire season. So in general, on average, the number of acres burned in Arizona is around 250,000. And to date, and there's still some time left in the monsoon before the monsoon comes and extinguishes a lot of what's going on right now, we've experienced about 500,000 acres. So it has been a pretty active fire season so far, with the 2 main fires that we can talk about being the one in Tucson, the Bighorn Fire, which basically ripped through the entirety of the Santa Catalinas. Up to, I think it's now pretty well contained. Update today came in at about 78% contained, or maybe it's 85%, but it hasn't, that percent has remained steady over the last week or so. So they've been able to gain control over it. You've been paying close attention to this, I assume, because you're kind of a fire guy, Mike. What's your thoughts on this fire?
This is a big fire.
Brilliant.
No, it was amazing to me to, have a fire that literally burns in your backyard. I mean, we watched it every night for the last 5 weeks because we could see fire, got our binoculars out, and you could see the progression of it. But I mean, what's striking to me was that it started at low elevation and it burned up to the top of the mountain and then burned back down to the same starting elevation. That to me that's quite a fire. And I think that the Bush Fire did the same thing, where it started at low, burned right up over a ridge, and then burned back down the other side. And I think that that's a real testament to having a lot of that fine fuel loading to work with this year, because you wouldn't necessarily have fires of that extent if you didn't have a lot of that lower elevation grasses and herbaceousness.
Yeah, I mean, it's been omnipresent here in Tucson since, I think it started on June 5th.
June 5th, yep.
So we're working on more than a month, constantly seeing smoke. And I guess like the 2 thoughts that I had, because for the most part, I've never been as close to a fire for as long of a period as this one. And I think that when you're out riding or out walking or out just driving around and you see it there, you see it over a long period of time, you're thinking about it changes. And one of the things, so a couple thoughts that I've had is just how amazing it has been that we live in a place where they can try to control it. Right.
Yeah.
Like, I think the amount of money that, and they publish this, I think it's up to like $35 million that it's taken to control this fire. And that's the other thought that I had as I'm watching this through time, and it's still raging and just these plumes of smoke are coming up. I'm thinking about actually how they're fighting it, and like firefighting. And they're not, to me, it's like, they're not really fighting it. They're just sort of trying to guide it. And obviously trying to guide it away from humans like Summerhaven and some of the lower elevation areas where the fire was sort of making its way down these canyons toward houses. And, they're concentrating their efforts there and trying to do backburns and all this stuff. And it's really just like the fire kind of does what the fire wants to do. And like, we basically have to wait until Mother Nature kicks in for it to be fully quelled.
You guys can correct me, but I don't think they lost a single structure. Did they in this fire? So there's been no and there's been a handful of injuries, kind of occupational injuries. I think of some of the firefighters.
7 injuries, heat injuries,
which kind of makes sense for this time of year. For 120,000 acre fire burning next to an urban area and then through actual summer homes, that's pretty good. I think they got some lucky breaks, but the fire management of the creation of lines and the use of air tankers, the DC-10s dropping slurry, just the constant helicopter work. I don't know if you guys were watching like the flight tracking, or we could see the helicopters from our house, but they'd put those pumpkins out with full of water and they'd put the dip buckets in, and they were doing that for weeks, I think. And so they got it to go around Summerhaven, and we watched the video of it burning. The fire burned through the fire department up on the ridge with the webcam going.
Yeah, that was a crazy webcam. So you're watching the webcam and you're seeing actual live fire, and it's like right next to the camera, and you're like, oh, this is just like a matter of hours before the cam goes blank. And it didn't.
Yeah. No, it didn't. I mean, they clearly were firewise with the fire station. Good for them. The fire went through, and then there's like a Boy Scout camp, and there's Willow Canyon's got summer houses. So that area, they had to move the fire on and do structure protection. And that was impressive. The fire made a run down towards the houses near Reddington, down on the San Pedro. They had a fire line there. Oracle, the same thing, had a fire line there where it could have run downhill into Oracle. So it's been pretty impressive. They've had to clearly work hard at kind of moving it around. And like I think you started off with too, it's July 10th, and I'm surprised I still see smoke, because we had showers pop up and thunderstorms pop up on July 3rd. I think it was the 2nd or the 3rd through Tucson. The humidity went way back up, but the fire has kind of rebounded. We've had the temperatures come way back up. And so I think the relative humidities have dropped again, even with the new humidity we were working with right now, kind of at the beginning of the monsoon here.
So in the last month, did we have more or less, or was it kind of a typical windy period? To me, it seemed like we had fewer sort of red flag warnings. Do you know?
Yeah, I don't know on the lookup side of it. I think that June was probably pretty normal.
Yeah.
As far as, it wasn't particularly windy. I can remember some very, very windy Junes. 2011 really stands out. That was that big fire year. June is a transition month away from the mid-latitude westerlies, which would create the wind. And we had some pressure from some passing storms to the north, but they've largely subsided. And so we didn't end up having that as much. Right when we recorded the podcast that day in mid-June, big wind event and red flag warnings that day. And it made a huge run around the north side of the mountain.
Do you think the background climate and weather conditions sort of favored a big fire or not? I'm not talking like drought. I'm talking about like just the sort of ambient conditions as the fire is going. Like, could this have been, did we get lucky that it was only this level? And that's hard to say because it's the biggest fire on Mount Lemmon in recorded history.
We're going to have this discussion again later after the burn severity mapping is done to really be able to characterize whether or not this was largely a beneficial fire or not. The lower elevation fires are probably never beneficial if they're burning through areas that don't normally burn. You know, if they're burning through patches of invasives or if they're burning through succulents like cacti that are not fire adapted, that's never a good thing. But some of those canyons probably needed fire. And if they did get some good fire in there, that could have opened up some areas for new vegetation. That's good. Some areas that we're trying to recover from the aspen fire that burned hot again, it's probably not good. But then the slow burning fires in the understory of the ponderosa pine were probably good. So it's probably this giant mixed bag. It's this weird thing too, because it happened in a year. We've had 2 winters where precip was good during the wintertime. So that may have helped with the bigger live fuel, like the trees may have been in a better spot as far as withstanding fire. They weren't super drought stressed. But again, there's this kind of ongoing creeping drought stress with increasing temperatures and, you know, climate change that's stressing trees overall every year now, even with the good winters. So, you know, it's just kind of a mixed bag. I think people who study fire and do fire ecology, we need to have fire move through these areas. So maybe again, it's going to be what's the net? Is it going to be a net positive, net negative? And I don't think we'll know yet until we do a lot of that mapping.
Well, just to put this in a little bit of context, the other main fire that we think about in the Santa Catalinas on the Mount Lemmon area was the aspen fire. And that was June 17th. It started in 2003. So you have to go back 17 years. It actually ripped through, unfortunately, it burned 340 buildings, it says here on the Wikipedia page. And it burned, and again, this puts the current size of the Bighorn fire in context. The aspen fire burned close to 85,000 acres. So big fire there, but this one is much larger, but fortunately not as consequential in terms of human damage. And the cost for that, although, you know, it's the expenses increased here, so these aren't normalized figures, but was somewhere in the vicinity of $20 to $25 million. And right now, like I said before, I think I said 32 million as of today, June 10th, 37 million for the Bighorn fire. Mm-hmm. So quite a lot of resources. But again, I'm just so thankful that, you know, we live in a country that can actually dedicate these kinds of resources to fighting it, because if not, there would have been a lot of homes that would have gone up in flames for sure.
I think that's right. And just seeing those DC-10s, you know, that we've all flown on DC-10s just on commercial airliners, but to watch them drop behind the mountain ridges and paint those giant pink stripes on the mountain is something I have never seen before. That
was really interesting too, because I saw a couple where there was like a spotter plane flying, and the spotter plane was like in front of the DC-10.
Yes.
And then it would like let out some smoke or some signal that told the DC-10 pilot to drop its load. And so it's not just one plane, it's multiple.
I watched a video of one of the firefighters up on the Catalinas. He showed the spotter plane go overhead, and I think they dropped water as like to mark it. And then the DC-10 was like not very far behind them, and wherever that spotter plane painted it, that slurry came down. And I think we had 3 DC-10s working it. There was so much air traffic over the mountain. There was way more air traffic over the mountain than there was over the Tucson airport. You know, at the height of it. I mean, there were so many spotter aircraft and helicopters, and then these crazy commercial aircraft are coming in, converted to slurry drops. It was something else. And it's just so weird to go out, you know, you go walking around and you see all these like graffiti stripes of pink on the mountain still there.
Yeah, I know. We get a good, it's like looking at red rocks. You're like, oh wait, those
That's
aren't
not right. Exactly.
And the other thing, just quickly before we move on, it's all mitigation until the monsoon comes.
Totally. I can go out in our backyard right now and still see smoke on the mountains. And I was convinced, I think that's because I'm such a monsoon optimist, even though my monsoon fantasy bets don't look like it, was that there's just no way we're going to still have smoke rising on July 10th.
Yeah. Well, so what about the bushfire? I haven't spent as much time thinking about the bushfire, but I mean, it, for all intents and purposes, is out before or fully contained before the monsoon comes. Although I'm sure like once the rains do come, it'll put a final end to it. But anything worth that you've paid attention to that's worth talking about with the bushfire? It's burned close to 200,000 acres, like we said before, and I think it's the fourth or fifth largest fire now in the history of Arizona. Let me just call up this list here. So the Wallow Fire was number one at 2011, close to 500,000 or over 500,000 acres. Rodeo Chetasky 2002, 470,000 acres. Cave Creek Complex 2005, 240,000 acres. Horseshoe Fire in 2011. Oh boy, 2011. I forgot about that. That was 220,000. And then the bushfire at a little under 200,000.
Yeah, so, right. It started, you told me this too. It was a vehicle fire that started it, right?
Human caused.
Human caused fire. And there was
still under investigation, they say, but it's believed to be human caused.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's what I remember hearing too. Started low elevation and heavy fine fuels, and it was carried east in the strong upslope west winds, and burned right up over, wasn't it the Manzanitas? Wasn't the Mazatzal Mountains? And they used one of the state highways as a fire break, and it stopped right there they used that as a fire line. The entire eastern fire perimeter is the state route. It's 188.
Well, I guess we should also say, as I'm looking at this list, the Mangum fire this year comes in at the 11th largest in the history of Arizona, recorded fire history, which doesn't go back all that long, but it's still ongoing. I don't know what it's contained at. It's on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, close to 60,000 acres. So yeah, quite an active fire. Those three seem to have started around the similar time. It was the too soon at that point. A little bit of rain, some lightning caused the Bighorn fire. It's unknown about the Mangum, and obviously what we just said, the bushfire was caused by human. Do you know when the bushfire started? June 16th. So it started later. New Mexico, we should just mention New Mexico. New Mexico has total fires caused both human and lightning, just 55,000 acres as of a few days ago. So quite a different picture.
It's interesting too, because the drought monitor map, if you're using that as a guide for where the fires would be, they don't quite line up. We're in basic kind of drought free to abnormally dry in much of Arizona and much of northern New Mexico, especially with that kind of winter drought situation. Not seeing the fires yet to the magnitude that we are.
Well, it just goes to show you that, the background climate state obviously plays a role, but isn't the only role to play. And there could be complicated relationships. I mean, it's that I don't know what drought timescale you're looking at, but these things can have signals that go back years.
Right.
So it's not just the immediate, last 6 months or last 9 months that matter. It could be multiple years.
Totally. And I think fire is not a kind of single variable, doesn't have a single variable predictor.
Hopefully the peak of the fire season for Arizona is usually late June and into July. And as we've talked about before, sort of tamps down when the monsoon comes in. So Mike, okay, so we have to unpack the monsoon. A couple things we've got to unpack. There was an incursion of moisture right around sort of the 1st of July, 2nd of July, that kind of gave us a whiff of the monsoon. But it was an interesting sort of incursion. It didn't produce a whole bunch, though there were places, particularly to southeast of Tucson, for example, that, there was some isolated areas with rains. And if you were in those places, you're like, all right, the monsoon's here. But for the most part of Arizona and New Mexico, that area, we just got a little bit of, our swamp coolers didn't work quite as well. And there wasn't enough moisture to get the monsoons fired up in earnest. So, and then, since then it's been kind of bleak. We had a dip in the moisture. So let's talk about that first event and go from there. Why didn't it generate more persistent and widespread rain?
It's a good question. I've been kind of just trying to piece it together. I think I might even just step back one step and talk about the expectations for the progression that we see in the early monsoon season to now. And we, again, cleanly, climatologically, long-term averages, you see this in the literature, and you look at this when you start to analyze the statistics of like the upper level fields and upper level windfall patterns, is a progression of the mid-level anticyclone or mid-level subtropical ridge, 500 millibars, 20,000 feet or so, basically marching north from Mexico up into the southwest, and then the proverbial four corners high is what that turns into. So that clean progression leads to a subtle change in the wind direction at the mid-levels of the atmosphere, which also then connects to a transition in the air mass, where we go from that dry May, June air mass that's hot and dry to a subtropical air mass that's on the south side of that ridge. So we're then into the subtropics. That's the nice, clean climate world that I like to live in, where everything follows normal distributions and everything follows climatology and stuff like that. Well, daily weather maps don't often look like that, and they look like a mess.
Well, what you're saying is you became a climatologist because it's easier to get your mind around.
Control and order and simplicity. Absolutely. Yeah. It's like, so I studied meteorology, and I was like, this isn't going to work. So just go down the road.
I gravitated toward climate science as well.
Right. And you see everything I try to do it's very frequentist. Whatever happens the most is what I want to run. So the progression of the subtropical ridge north, and the moisture has not been very, very clean, and very, Mexico has really struggled in June with the progression of the precipitation they normally see up the mountain range in Mexico. And you can look at the position of that 500 millibar anticyclone subtropical ridge, and the best kind of position of it, and that best sort of movement of rainfall up into southern Arizona in particular was that July kind of second, third period, where the ridge did move into position. There was a flare up of moisture, and the moisture reached up into Arizona at that point.
Was it pushed in the position? If I remember, there was an easterly wave or a low pressure system that off like Baja that helped drive it north. I believe either Mike Luthold or Bob Maddox, two of the guys that are really go-to sources of monsoon information here in the Southwest, was calling it sort of an unusual, if you will, monsoon setup. It wasn't like the canonical position. I don't know if you remember that at all.
Yeah, that's correct. It was. I'm looking back at Mike Luthold's blog right now, which is, these are climatological data sets too in their own right. It's like I'll go back to these blogs years later to go and try to diagnose an event. And looking at Bob's, Mike is saying here, this isn't a traditional monsoon pattern because the subtropical ridge at that point had not kind of moved into position. It had gotten better over subsequent days, but then we lost the moisture source on the other side of it there. So an increase in precipitable water, kind of that measure of the integrated water in the atmosphere and millimeters depth through the whole column of the atmosphere, really popped up because of that guided. We had this pattern of some smaller scale features that were kind of gearing up and guiding the moisture north, which is not unlike what we had in late May and then again in early June. So not really monsoonal in the sense of this big air mass transition because everything is in the right spot, but more of we're kind of feeding moisture up into it, kind of forcing it, I think is what you were saying there earlier.
Right. It was very similar to that too soon pattern that
right.
So, like June 1st moisture in the region, although it didn't generate much precipitation.
Okay, so in that early part of July, we were in a southwesterly flow. That southwesterly flow was reaching into the subtropics, but that's more of a transition pattern. That would be something that you would see at the very beginning of the monsoon season. Like we've seen that as early as June, like way back to even like, remember Tropical Storm Bud that kicked us off right on the 15th a couple of years ago? That's that kind of forcing the moisture into the region, getting widespread stuff kicked off.
And then once that thing went away, everything retracted.
That's basically it, because we're on the very northern boundary, and we're not actually into the fundamental air mass transition that you're going to see as a subtropical ridge pushes to the north. So we're just like today and yesterday. I don't know if you guys were watching all the last couple of days. The storms have been right at the border, and they've just been they've been exhaling all of this moisture to the north. And one of them got close enough last night where the anvil went over Tucson, and oh my God, thank God it broke the sun at that point because it was miserable. But we had this big slug of moisture. The dew points at my house were up in the low 60s. And that was like the first kind of day where it started to feel like, okay, this is where you're starting to get it's getting close enough now that we're going to get settled into the pattern.
Well, I think it's important to sort of try to visualize that, what the position of the high does. And if people can think of it like, it kind of acts as a barrier. If the center of that high is sort of over, let's say Tucson, for example, the moisture can't come up beyond, it acts as a block. And so you need that whole high to move north, which then allows the moisture to move up into the area. And so that high pressure system and its position is really consequential because it basically it's a gauge on how far the moisture can move northward, more or less.
It's not a physical barrier. It's more of it's an indicator of, because the moisture really isn't at 500 millibars, so it's not really the flow around it, but it kind of signals broader synoptic patterns where, if you're on the north side and if your upper level winds are in the westerlies, that really does kind of translate down in the rest of the atmosphere, that you're probably stacked up and still dragging in moisture, or your air mass is still going to be more characterized out of kind of that westerly flow, which is dry, right? And so that's in this whole, as that ridge moves north, that north side of the ridge, as you go to the northwest, that's the hot, dry summer desert that you're going to see like in the Mojave. It's the California kind of desert. And as you get kind of down and you're underneath the ridge, which is where we're at today, it's weak flow, it's stagnant. And then as you go south of that, then you're into deeper easterly flow, which is really subtropical. And there's all sorts of like topography interacting. There's the channeling of moisture through the pressure differential up the Gulf of California, which then actually gets pulled up an upslope flow underneath the ridge, in a good Gulf surge event. And then there's hopefully low-level moisture flow up the Gulf of Mexico that's getting into New Mexico, which has been it hasn't been there. It's been quite dry. And then it's the march of the moisture up the mountains of Mexico that literally kind of kicks the moisture down the road, and it gets it a day closer every day as new thunderstorms. And so we're right there. And I wish we would have been where we are today 2 weeks ago. If we would have gotten it kicked off a little bit earlier, that might have given us more chance for more interesting monsoon season. We're getting late now.
I guess then, one of the questions is, has there been anything pushing down on that ridge? I mean, it's an interplay with what's going on to its south and what's going on to its north. And, if the question is, for the monsoon to get kicked off, you really do need the high to be in a favorable position to get the moisture incursion. And then later on in August, say, or late July, after the monsoon is sort of ramped up and there's moisture around, other things are able to come into play. And so the position of the high isn't as consequential. But back to the question, why has the ridge just not moved as far north?
Yeah, it's been busy. I mean, the mid latitudes are still quite busy, and we were looking at temperature across the west there, and you're commenting on how nice Portland is right now. Well, there's been kind of late season troughs and rainy weather still moving into the Pacific Northwest, and so that whole translation of the weather pattern, the storm systems coming in the mid latitudes, if they're able to press down, the subtropical ridge is shunted south, and then we're back in the westerlies, and we're in that drier air mass. And so we've seen that kind of come and go, and we've had some really good, solid, dry days in between some humid days in June. I'm like a living hygrometer with having a swamp cooler. Like you literally get tuned up to know what the outdoor dew point is by living with a swamp cooler. It is quite fantastic, except for today. Like I know what the dew point is out today, and it's way above 55 right now because of that. But there were days when it got down to like 20, and the cooler was working great. House is cool. And the only way in your head, you're like, okay, the reason it's a 20-degree day dew point out here is because there's some weather system that is like pushed hard on the monsoon ridge and pushed all the moisture back to the south. I'm
not sure in the entirety of human history, the words I'm a living human hydrometer have ever been said together.
Hygrometer, man. Hygrometer. Hygrometers used to be made out of human hair. And so my beard is like, look at this.
Oh my God. All right. No, we're not going back there. But then, the question then becomes, okay, so what's driving the busyness of, the subtropical jet?
Well, it's mid latitude.
Or the mid latitude jet. Sorry, I said that.
Yeah, I don't know. I read the Climate Prediction Center prognostic discussions, and at this time of year, you're looking for something upstream forcing. The thing is that all the typical things that influence the mid latitude jet at this time of year, the mid latitude jet is shrinking towards the poles. I think as we've talked about, as the whole northern hemisphere heats up, and so the mid latitude jet's going to be responding to the temperature gradient in the northern hemisphere. Well, that decreases and goes north. So that's where you should start to see these subtropical ridges, the land surface heating, promoting the growth and the extent of the subtropical ridge. The mid-level anticyclone usually takes over. So it's just whatever upstream weather is wiggling around, and we've seen a lot of that, and we saw that last summer. But this summer is different, and I don't think it's going to be long-lived. I think it's... So
before we go there, though, that raises a couple questions. You brought up a lot of interesting things. So what would be a favorable sort of monsoon outlook then is if the mid-latitude jet is not circuitous, or it's not wiggly. The technical term wiggly, right? It's more linear, if you will, and farther north. It's retracted further north. Yep. What would create that scenario?
The summertime, it gets a little weird. I mean, and I'm not super well versed in the mid latitude jet dynamics in the summertime. The super simple would be, okay, so there's been a lot of discussion about the Arctic sea ice extent. That's usually at the tail ends of the season, I think, when you see the biggest response. The Madden-Julian oscillation doesn't typically have a real strong mid-latitude expression in the summertime, much more in the wintertime, but it can influence the East Asian monsoon. And the East Asian monsoon can influence the mid-latitude jet, which can then subsequently influence the downstream wave pattern. And I haven't really been following that.
I mean, it's just a web, it's just like,
oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
You ding something, and obviously it has impacts on these other nodes that you're talking about, but then they ding other things. And it's like all this web that's really hard to unpack. And I think part of what I'm hearing you say is this is why it is like really difficult to sort of forecast an onset of the monsoon.
Yeah, and so I mean, the Climate Prediction Center was really open and honest about how challenging the onset for this season was going to be, and they knew that in late May, and a lot of that comes back to the work of, one of our colleagues, Chris Castro, who's looked at the North American monsoon system in relation to ENSO, either El Nino or La Nina, and there's some weak correlations between El Nino, antecedent El Nino conditions, which probably were at play a year ago for our 2019 season, or a La Nina, which can signal a much easier time for the subtropical ridge to kind of push north and get us kind of early season access to the moisture. So this year, we're neutral transitioning to La Nina, very weak signal. Weather is winning out right now in our particular system. And so you'll see the outlooks, so the seasonal outlooks don't have anything to really grab onto, which is why they're equal chances. The 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day forecasts are kind of at the outer envelope, and they're going to be probabilistic. Well, they've been very consistent on having a late start for weeks now. And so they've been correct. And that's been largely the dynamical models seeing that the subtropical ridge was struggling. And you see it in the weather, like even if you look at the weather map for the last couple of days, it's been wet along the northern tier of the country, and the subtropical ridge is flat right now. And it's now just building north again, because it will build north because it's getting so freaking hot across the country, and the mid-latitude jet will retreat. So that kind of heat dome does take over eventually. And it's just kind of then where its position is, and if that monsoon moisture can kind of get up in here. So we're just in a late start, and it's gonna probably take off in the next couple of weeks. And my final thing, it's kind of a long rant. I just looked at the week 3-4 forecast, which is issued by Climate Prediction Center. And there's a little Easter egg in the discussion that just like, I got like butterflies in my stomach, because it said that the ECMWF, the European Center model, has wet conditions for the Southwest, but it was the outlier. So, but that's like the gold standard weather model. It is suggesting that the monsoon onset's going to happen next couple of weeks, but it wasn't the main model. The rest of the models still look bleak.
It's not much of a prediction.
You're not.
Well, I mean, yeah. In the next couple, so we're talking like before July 14th, which I think there isn't. I think that's a good bet, just based on history here. Like most of the monsoons begin, even the late ones begin before then. But I want to go back to another important thing that you said, which is this year is not like last year, and so last year was kind of dismal. Particularly here in Tucson. The first rain at the airport didn't happen, and it wasn't that much. It was 1/4 of an inch. It didn't happen until July 13th. You said that this monsoon season isn't like last monsoon season. So let's unpack that a little bit. Like what is different about this season than last season?
Well, not a lot so far. It's just, they're very similar. I guess I think that in hindsight, and I really wasn't hanging my hat on the kind of lingering El Nino effect that I do think some people really picked up on. I think Climate Prediction Center probably hung their hat on that a little bit more, or at least there was a wave pattern that was putting pressure on the subtropical ridge position that really did persist. And so what we ended up having was through July and through a lot of the summer was that the subtropical ridge was kind of, when it did build north, it built to the northeast, and the trough was hanging out across California. And so what you saw was the moisture boundary in the kind of that monsoon moisture transition we were talking about, the air mass transition. It was draped across the state. And so Flagstaff effectively was in the dry kind of Nevada air mass almost all summer, right? Which is how you get to have your record driest. You end up having the monsoon that you'd expect to see in like in Nevada, which is non-existent, was kind of translated down to Flagstaff. Tucson was we were still kind of in the soup. It just wasn't great. And then all of that kind of Great Plains moisture, they did quite well off to the east. So it's not super different right now. The ridge is building overhead. The models really indicate that we're going to have a big, broad subtropical ridge. So it's going to look different. The key will be, and if the models just aren't dealing well with the precipitation mechanisms, which I don't think they do real well with. They do good with the big broad scale stuff, but all the interesting stuff with the monsoon is all that kind of like terrain, the topography in the mountains driving the convection. They can't see the mountains and where the moisture sources are, and triggering of a Gulf surge that then causes moisture recycle. To me, that looks different over the next couple of weeks than we would have saw this same time last year.
Right. And if I recall last year, what was particularly frustrating about it was that there was moisture around. It's just the atmospheric dynamics, the thermodynamics, if you will, wasn't set up to actually squeeze the moisture squeeze the atmosphere of its moisture. So it wasn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, it wasn't so much that we were lacking precipitable water. It's just that we were lacking the mechanisms to make it rain.
But again, the gradient of precipitable water was stark across the state. And so, parts of far southeast Arizona did quite well because they were in the soup and the dynamics were good, but there wasn't anything to squeeze out when you got up north of,
like
Phoenix.
Flagstaff, right?
Yeah, and you got to like kind of the far northwest corner. It just didn't happen. And
Tucson was right on that, right in the margins then of where there was moisture available.
Yeah. And again, I think that's part of that subtropical ridge position, and having deep easterly flow across the entire southwest in Arizona, that air mass is lifted north. And so then you can start to see the, big outbreaks of thunderstorms that are across the whole Mogollon Rim here in Arizona that can then translate downhill. And you can even get the rainers out way into the lower Colorado River Valley as well. But I don't remember seeing many, if any, of those kind of events last year. But again, I'm like, I have this kind of like fuzzy picture of the whole season, and overall it wasn't great. And it was terrible. It was like record bad for some spots of the state.
So this morning in preparation, I was looking for like, okay, what are key numbers for the monsoon? What are things that describe the monsoon that would be useful to talk about? And I came up with a couple. I wanted to share one with you. So I looked back in the last 10 years, and I asked the question, well, how many years in the last decade has the monsoon started later than the current day? So later than July 10th. 3.
Wow.
Yep. So 3. So this is not all that uncommon.
Right.
So the 3 years we already talked about 2019. First precip in 2019 didn't happen at the airport in Tucson. So this is my frame of reference here until July 13th, 2017, and then 2010. So then the next question became, well, if we've started late and let's say we've started at the very least a week late than we otherwise would, what does that mean for the monsoon season as a whole when we look back on it, right? 2019 was not very good as a whole. I'm looking at your plots, Mike, and it was the 49th, ranked 49th wettest out of 72. So what would that be in terms of driest? 23rd driest. So anyway, to give you numbers, we're like an inch below what average in Tucson. And that was for last year. So 2017, however, was a pretty good year. And I've talked about this pretty good monsoon season. And I talk about this quite a bit as that late July period being, there was like a 3-week stretch in 2017 where it was just unbelievable. And 2017 ended up being close to 2.5 inches above average. In fact, it was the ninth wettest on record out of 70 years in this. So, and then 2010, it was about a half an inch below average. And each of them have different patterns. But I guess the point that I want to make here is that, yeah, we started a little late. We've lost a week. On average, that would mean about two days of rainfall. It makes us harder to make that up, but we're certainly not locked into a bad monsoon season.
No, this is such a good kind of line of discussion that you brought up, making that distinction that the July, August, September total monsoon season precip, since July is part of that, if you end up with below average precip for the month, the whole season it's very difficult to make up the deficit of 1 month in a 3-month total, but it can happen, right? And so I think even to make the point too of like, we're 10 days into July, does it mean we're doomed? Actually, no. And one reason is that if you look at the precipitation patterns, more often than not, much of that precipitation comes after July 15th anyways for much of the Southwest. So we got kind of those two things kind of going for us right now. I think it's just good to say we're getting a little panicked. I'm certainly getting a little panicked with not seeing, the rain that we'd expect to see flourishing across Arizona and New Mexico. New Mexico's really struggled too so far, but it can turn around very, very quickly. And I think your 2017, is a really good one to unpack a little bit more too.
Unpack it, baby.
Well, we come back to your 2017, man. You should get that tattooed. I just didn't see it across your back is like the cumulative precip plot for 2017. And then maybe we could like shade in a couple of your awesome photos you took from there. Like I can see the tattoo artist right now working on this kind of blend in. And actually my face is one of those kind of profile pics this look really good. The point being in 2017 is that the seasonal total, almost all the seasonal total for July, August, September happened in 2 weeks in July for Tucson.
I know. And that's actually worth pausing on a little bit. It started late then, and then it just went gangbusters for a little over 2 weeks, as Mike said. And we basically got nearly 7 inches of rain. The average for Tucson is close to 6 inches. So we in a 3-week period, little under 3-week period, we got 7 inches of rain. And then, at the end of July, there was basically just one more meaningful event at the airport. And, there could have been isolated areas elsewhere that filled in different dates for other areas. But at the airport, just one other meaningful event, close to slightly over an inch. So a substantial amount of rain then. And you know what? I remember I look back on that monsoon, and those 3 weeks made all of the other weeks, the 7 other weeks that were dry, worth it. So
it's so true. I mean, I'm looking at this. It rained almost every day for a period of like this is really unusual for monsoon season. So the whole, the monsoon season is here in southern Arizona, especially, is the thunderstorm events are occurring underneath the high pressure system, which is not super ideal. It's fighting a lot of unfavorable thermodynamics. You got to overcome it with a lot of moisture. So typically when you have a big day, it's usually a down day the next day. So you're kind of doing this like reset. I don't remember what happened in 2017, but I'm looking at like there was a run of 5 days in a row where the airport recorded either a quarter or a half inch in the middle of the month. Like that's hard to do. That's nuts. And so there must have been some other like tropical circulations or really good brisk easterly flow that would help reset the atmosphere, good access to moisture. I mean, like it seems kind of, these were special conditions that you wouldn't normally see. And again, it's like the season is kind of an interesting one to look at more. I'll kind of have to dig into it. But what happened after August 15th that it was done? It literally, as far as rainfall, and if you look at the temperatures too, the temperatures climbed back up there through the rest of August and through beginning of September, it looked unpleasant, even after that really good July.
We were all basking though at that point.
Been in a glow for years now, 2017. It's like your senior year in high school, man. It's like you want to just live it over and over again.
That was my junior year.
Oh, sorry.
I had a great junior year. It is true to say that the further you go into July and the further that there is less rain, the harder it is to make that up.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the season in aggregate, let's say we don't get rain until July 24th. If I'm betting on that point for above or below average rain for wherever, I'm betting a lot of money on below.
Yeah.
It's not to say it can't happen the other way, but it's just you're tipping the scales. The other point I think is also to think about this in terms of that July is not a predictor for August or September. There are different mechanisms, nuances of the monsoon, and we by month, if you will, or by period, however you want to break it up, as the monsoon evolves, things change a little bit. And we alluded to this before, 10 or 20 minutes ago, by talking about the position of the ridge. Well, the position of the ridge is really consequential in the beginning of the monsoon to get that monsoon started, but then becomes less important, if you will, later on in the monsoons. And one of those reasons is because moisture recycling is so important, and just for creating that moisture that can then become rain. And some studies looked at the different sources from the Gulf of California, Gulf of Mexico to the land surface recycling, and have quantified it as the second most important source next to that which is coming from the Gulf of California, somewhere in the vicinity of like 40%. So as we get rain, as we're raining on the landscape to our south and locally, we're able to then have that as its own source, and that position of the ridge becomes less important as the mechanism for bringing moisture into the region. So to summarize, the flavors of the monsoon, they change in season and the mechanisms change.
Totally agree. And I think that the subtropical ridge, it has sharper features at the beginning of the season because of the broader circulation of the northern hemisphere with the temperature gradients. Those weaken. And so by late July and into August, really good monsoon seasons, you'll often just see a big sprawling, weak, stagnant high pressure system. Sometimes the subtropical ridge has like all these little high pressure systems, and it's just like this big swampy, soupy air mass that we're dealing with across the Southwest. And then you're looking at smaller features in the flow, little easterly waves, inverted troughs, old remnant cyclonic circulations that become the focusing features for the bigger events at the end of the season. So like you said, kind of, a 3-period game, a 3-act play. We're in the opening act right now where we're just trying to get the air mass moved in here. And we're going to do it through a combination of the local recycling of the moisture as it's kind of marching up the Sierra in Mexico, getting a good Gulf surge activated, kind of crashing those two moisture sources together and really wetting the soil here will get us going. And then you start to play with a lot of that moisture in August. And then by late August into September, the mid-latitudes are starting to come back south, and we're now going to fight the erosion of that moisture source because we're going to be back into the westerlies. But it's also the season where you can start to see all that moisture still at play, and then having cooler air masses descend from the north give us steeper lapse rates and can help recurve that moisture from the East Pacific back into the region too. So it gives you a whole other, like those big widespread rain events are much more common later in the season than they are earlier in the season.
Looking at this point, Mike, of regional, really widespread regional events, I just want to bring up the paper that I recently read. It's not new. It's 2013 by James Favors and John Abatsoglu. It's called Regional Surges in Monsoon Moisture in the Southwestern United States. And so they were characterizing these events these widespread events that created, on average, a fair amount of rainfall spatially averaged over Arizona. And they were looking at, well, what's the sort of dynamics that, we're not talking about these spotty convective cells, one here and one there. We're talking about the sort of patterns that set up that really drive rainfall across a large swath of Arizona. And they noted an interesting pattern. First of all, I should say that they identified, using a specific criteria, that these regional events are only about 2 times per year. So not many of them, but they can generate up to half of the rainfall in any given season. So those 2 events can account for a large fraction of the total monsoon rainfall. So they're really important setups. And what they found is that the patterns that produce these were this easterly wave wafting from the east to the west, wafting across Mexico, followed by a trough off the coast of California to the west. And that sort of synoptic pattern, which doesn't have that canonical 4 corners high, and this ties back into what we were talking about a minute ago, that the position of the 4 corners high was sort of retracted to the east. And the easterly wave followed by that trough off the coast of California created this conduit for just this rush of moisture up far into northern Arizona and whatnot. And that these happened, like what you were just saying, not so much in July, but they were patterns that were more favorable later on in the monsoon season. So I thought that was really interesting. Just that you just get these different sort of features, easterly waves followed by this trough off the coast of California, that can create these settings that are really favorable for widespread rainfall.
That would align well with the transition pattern in the kind of the old classic Bob Maddox severe weather event typings for the Southwest for the monsoon season. It has all the ingredients that you'd want, which would be moisture and possibly some upper level dynamics and good steep lapse rates. Those 3 things can come and go, and sometimes they can cross each other where the moisture is good, but you don't have any dynamics often in the middle of the monsoon season because you're underneath a giant sprawling ridge and you're waiting for small upper level features. We're actually today, the moisture is really getting to climatological levels. Well, it's trying to anyways, but the mid-levels are very warm because the mid-level anticyclone is right overhead. And so that's going to be the kind of the maximum of those mid-level warms. So you don't have the steepness. If you could inject another ½ inch of moisture underneath this ridge, you could spark thunderstorms on the mountains that might even turn into valley rain. And if you had the opposite, where you had marginal moisture, but you had some cool air coming in overhead with a little inverted trough, or even like a mid-latitude trough, you could spark good thunderstorms from that. But it's like getting those things to work together is often hard. That pattern that you described is kind of like the trifecta of having those 3 things with dynamics and lapse rates and moisture all coming together. And they're transitional too. You don't necessarily, it'd be unusual, I think, to see that in mid-season because of its reliance on having that mid-latitude support.
So you just brought up a fairly complicated concept that I think we should try to explain, because it's really important, and it goes back to the sort of thermodynamics in the atmosphere and what's really important. It was one of the reasons why last monsoon season, at least here in Tucson, didn't produce as much rainfall as it otherwise could have, because those dynamics just weren't there. And so let me try to explain this. So basically, a good setup is where you have the ability for near surface air to be buoyant and to move up to higher levels in the atmosphere. And basically what you want is a favorable gradient in the atmosphere to do that. And so there's 2 levers that you can pull. you can have it really warm at the surface and really cold as you go up. And so you get a steep temperature gradient. What you don't want is a relatively similar or not steep, the opposite of steep gradient. So temperatures are not as cool or are warmer at upper levels. So that's one way to do it. The other way is to increase the surface moisture. And so more moisture at the surface with the temperature profile being the same is going to create more dynamics. And so as Mike was saying, those two things are at play. And so if you have sort of a temperature profile that isn't as favorable, you need more moisture. And if you have a really favorable temperature profile, a vertical temperature profile, you need less moisture. And if you had both, like a really favorable temperature vertical profile and a lot of moisture, you get a day that is ready to explode.
Yeah, no, nicely done. Yeah, and I think that's it kind of boils it down. I mean, there's the other interesting thing about, like, if you study thermodynamics for like the Great Plains, where everything is flat, you have this like really good understanding of the temperature gradients and where, CAPE is, convective available potential energy, what the mechanisms will be to maybe lift a parcel from the surface and liberate that CAPE, because cloud's going to reach condensation, it's going to release all that extra energy, it's going to race up because it's got a good temperature profile. The Southwest is like this mess of all this topography, and mountain ranges have different thermodynamic profiles than the valleys. And so that's why, like, the high resolution modeling that Mike Luthold and Will Holmgren do becomes so valuable, because you can see these really strong spatial gradients from the middle of Tucson to just 5 miles away to the top of the Catalinas, and see how they're going to have completely different days just based on one sticking up in the atmosphere and one being down in the valley, and how the valley can just not see anything while the terrain force convection takes off. And that even becomes part of the bigger story in, Mexico, with the elevated terrain and the access to the moisture become such a focal point that they have fairly reliable monsoon seasons. We're at kind of the northern periphery of that and need to have those different levers pulled in just the right way, like you said, Zach.
In summary, monsoon's late, but have faith. It doesn't lock us in quite yet to a bad monsoon or a below average monsoon. And that's particularly important for me, Mike, because...
Good transition.
Because I was very bullish, if you will, on our monsoon fantasy. Let's finish up here by talking about the monsoon, and so the monsoon fantasy game. So just as a recap, we're playing this game where we're Mike and I, and we've invited people online as well through our listserv to play it with us. So we're picking the categories for each month that we think the rainfall will fall in for each of the 5 cities of Tucson, Phoenix, Flagstaff, Albuquerque, and El Paso. And so we sent out an email. We've gotten a total of 36 people who are playing along. And so I'm right now, and we'll post this online, but I'm looking at a heat map that shows what their guesses are. So just to recap, Mike, out of all 30, with Mike, there's 37. With me and Ben, there's 39 total. So out of the 39 total, Mike was the only person who guessed below average for all cities. Mike, what gives?
I told you, man, I was worried. I've got some trauma from last summer. I may not shake off. I don't have a 2017 to hold on to like you do. And the outlooks were not good. The 6 to 10 day, I'm a wish caster by birth, but I'm feeling a little pessimistic right now.
Okay, so when we do the average across all of the guesses, it's actually kind of remarkable. For Tucson, the average decile was 40 to 50%. For Phoenix, it was 40 to 50%. And for Flagstaff, it was 40 to 50%.
Climatology, I love it.
Now get this, for Albuquerque, New Mexico, it was 50 to 60%. for both of those. So there is range, and Phoenix in particular had a lot of range. A couple people thought that the precipitation would be below the 10 percentile. Some of them thought it would, 3 of them thought it would fall in the 10 to 20 percentile. Some of them actually thought it would be to the 80, 90 percentile. So Phoenix, out of all of the stations, had the most range. But it's remarkable that it's all kind of around climatology. So everybody's a climatologist at heart.
I think that's true. True in all aspects of life, actually.
Now, I'll also say this, and I think this is really interesting. So Albuquerque and El Paso were of higher estimates than the 3 Arizona cities. And the majority of the respondents were likely from Arizona, because we know that most of our audience is from Arizona. So I think that's a safe bet.
Because we don't talk about New Mexico enough.
But this is crazy. So it's like, if that's true, like one of the implications here is that we're a little bit more pessimistic about where we live and more optimistic about where other people live.
That's interesting.
Okay, so you were the only one that was below average on all of them. And there was 2 that were fully bearish or fully bullish on above average of the 39. So for the most part, they were sort of mimicking the variability that we see quite a bit during the monsoon season. So we have a very educated readership or listenership, if you will. Okay, so Mike, you picked 40 to 50% in Tucson. I picked 60 to 70% in Tucson. That's looking not very likely. And Ben picked 20 to 30%, which is looking a little bit better. So
I think, Ben may have nailed Tucson. I mean, 2017 as a rally cry, we could have 5 inches by the end of the month.
So I'm wondering, we got Ben on the line here, and he did a lot of, he's behind the scenes looking at this data, slicing it up, because it's just so fun to play with. You showed us a plot about looking at the distribution of this data. Now, recognizing that we don't have a lot of data points, so we're sort of filling in holes a little bit. But the distribution of these data points looked very similar to a distribution of the climatological record of the cities. Like it had the same shape and humps, even like the slight outliers.
Yeah, no, I think that's maybe one of the most interesting things that came out of it is any given guesser is kind of, some random points within that. But once we aggregated all the guesses, it started to look a lot like the distribution of all of the different years. And so what that says to me is that this crowdsourcing of a weather forecast, it starts to look pretty close to what those distributions look like. And we'll see how it actually plays out, because obviously it has to actually rain. But
we're on our way to making a community forecast here.
Yeah. Well, and the one thing is what we don't see a lot of guesses is in the extreme outliers, because those don't happen very often, but they do happen. So the guess distributions are a little compressed into those middle tercile or the middle deciles. We don't see a lot of guesses in the extreme deciles, which, is to be expected. But
didn't we just make another equal chances forecast?
Yes. So did the community. The community also made an equal chances forecast.
Okay, so that's awesome. So we have points associated with these. And so we'll tally up the points per month and per season. So in any given month, if you hit all 5 correct, you get 50 points. So your maximum amount of points over the season is 150. And so we're playing this game through time. So we hope that those who played July will also play August and September, and we'll be able to talk about the winning scores at the end, as well as the winning scores for each month, which we'll go over when we come back in August, and we'll have the final numbers for July based on our expectations, and we'll also tell everybody what our estimates and what other people's estimates are for August. So be on the lookout for emails, maybe even coming out with this pod, then we can remind people, but we'll also send it out as we get closer to August. And I would just make a note that if you do want your score to be tallied through time, we asked in the questionnaire for a game name, which could be your real name or just your pseudonym, and just make sure that you use that same name, because that's the way that we're able to aggregate the monthly scores together. So I'm like really excited about this, because I think this is a way of engaging with the community and trying to guess what the monsoon will be like. But also there's some interesting science questions here too, just about how people are thinking about the monsoon that we'll be able to unpack on this podcast. So thanks everybody for taking the time with that. Mike, any parting shots?
No, I think you said it earlier. Is no need to panic yet.
No need to panic yet. That's coming from the only person who put below average for all 5 cities.
Oh yeah, I did do that, didn't I?
Ben, any parting shots?
No, I just hope it rains soon.
Oh, me too, man. Me too.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll be back early to mid-August. And happy monsoon. We also, in addition to sending out questions about what people would pick in terms of the precipitation for different cities, we also asked a few other questions. And Mike, we got trolled quite a bit. So I think there was a sarcastic comment about not mentioning beards, which I just did. So I was trying to stay away from that. But I do have to comment once again, Mike, because it's looking good.